Welcome and thank you for everyone joining us this evening. As President of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, Alberta Provincial Council, I welcome you to today's session and hope that you have an interesting and informative session at that. Our organization has been in existence for over 50 years and has 23 member organizations, which we work together in and across many sites and towns across Alberta. We represent Ukrainian and Ukrainian Canadian culture, language, the voice of, as well as different and important issues with the community and with various political organizations. I want to thank Shauna for being here this evening and doing this presentation, and invite everyone to visit our website, where you can find more information about us and information about those who are coming from Ukraine to Canada and to Alberta. And I also would like to invite you all to become members of our member organizations, wherever you happen to live, because together we are strength in numbers. And have a wonderful session this evening, and welcome to you all. Дякую.
Shauna, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your time, and thank you for all your commitment, what you're doing for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me and spending time with me this evening. I hope to share a lot of great information for you. Employment standards is vital for essentially anyone working in Alberta. There are a few exceptions, but if you haven't worked in Alberta before, or maybe you have, there are minimum standards, so laws that the employer and yourself as an employee have to be aware of for working in Alberta. So I'm hoping to share some of that information with you today. It will be a lot of information, but I will provide links to you in the chat later on so that you can go and reference more information on our website. Essentially, my goal is just to make you aware that these things exist so that if something's happening in the workplace that you're not sure about, then you can go into our website or you can call our contact center, because we have one of those, and see whether or not there are entitlements that you should have or pay that you should be receiving. So today, we will go through a whole host of different informations, mainly some of the fundamental building blocks of what it's like to be an employee in Alberta in respects to pay and entitlements. As Nadia said, and Lydia, my name is Shauna. I am with Employment Standards. A little bit about me, I've been working with Employment Standards now for a little over 12 years. I started working in investigations and moved into an education role. I prefer this side of things, helping Albertans understand their rules rather than fixing kind of problems after the fact. So hopefully with this position, helping to prevent problems from happening by informing Albertans about rights and responsibilities. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we will have some time at the end of the session to kind of go through any questions that you might have. And we don't have too much time, so we'll just start in on our presentation, my presentation today. So as I mentioned, employment standards is in reference to minimum laws in Alberta. So the law sets this floor or table, and an employer and yourself can't agree for anything less than this minimum. They are minimums, so they're not going to be, the best things in the world, but it's a base level protection for people working in Alberta. So I'm going to provide today an overview of rules that generally apply to everybody, but depending on if you're in a different industry or if you're in an exempt job. So maybe you're a manager or supervisor. There may be different rules that apply to you. So it's really important to know what it is that you do for work. And then I lost all power. And then that's also important to know if different rules apply to you depending on the job. So we've set a minimum standard in the law. Employers can provide more if they want to. When they provide more, then we will enforce that greater amount as the new minimum. For example, $15 an hour is the minimum wage, but if your contract says that you're earning $20 an hour, then that's your new minimum wage. So employers can provide greater benefits if they wish to. Now, on this slide is more or less all of the core standards. So the basic building blocks of the law and employment in Alberta. I won't be going through everything. I also can talk for an hour for each topic. So there's a lot to learn, and we don't need you to learn everything. We just need you to know these things exist. So when, again, you're in the workplace and something's funny, then you can have a look at our website and check out what's the right information. So a quick overview of today's agenda. Again, really just touching on these subjects to make sure that you're aware of them, and then hopefully helping you understand your rights when you're working in Alberta. So one of the very first important things that a lot of individuals don't recognize is a fundamental part of protection is record keeping. It's kind of like you're trying to return something at Home Depot without a receipt. It's going to be a lot harder, but it's still possible. However, with a receipt, so the records, you're going to have a much better chance to ensure that whatever it is that you're owed, that you're going to be able to receive. Even though this requirement belongs to the employer, we can't always trust that they're going to do it right or accurately. So the most important thing to do is to protect ourselves as employees, to keep our own records. That could be text messages, offer letters, anything that involves the employer at any time. It's important to recognize that that might be evidence later when you're making a claim for, hey, I worked 40 hours, but they only paid me 30. Can you prove that you worked 40 hours? Something like a timesheet or text messages may show evidence of that. So this is all the obligations the employer needs to keep: what you worked for regular and overtime hours, what your wage rate was, if they made any deductions or paid vacation pay. They have to keep employment records for 3 years. So although, again, this is an employer's obligation, if they don't meet that and you have no records, then it's going to be, again, really difficult to determine, well, what did you work? What was your wage rate? What did you agree on for the contract? So the more information you have and that you've kept, the better chance you will have to fight for your rights. So whether they're paper or electronic, the employer has to keep some sort of record for you. And even though it's not legislated, so it's not in the law, text messages, emails, company policies, timesheets, all of these different things form evidence. And the more evidence that you have, the better position you're in. So let's talk quickly about wages. Essentially, not everybody, but when we're looking for a job, it's not necessarily the job that we're looking for. It's likely the wages, so the money that comes with the job. And if you don't know what to do when the money's wrong, or you don't know how to calculate it properly, then that's when you have to come to us for a little bit more help and support. So essentially, wages is that fundamental building block of pay is pay for the work that you do. It doesn't always necessarily mean like physical work. It could also mean time you spend traveling to a job site, depending on the circumstances of the day, or when an employer requires you to be at work and ready for work, and you have no other choice but to be there, then those instances, even though you might not be actively performing work, there may be cases where that's still payable time. The reason that wages are really important to understand is that it forms all of these other entitlements. So overtime pay, vacation pay, general holiday pay, all of these are calculated on top of wages. So we want to make sure that we know what the wages are so that all of these other entitlements are paid properly as well. One thing to note is that tips in Alberta are not considered wages. So if you're working in the service industry, where tips are a part of kind of your job and your income, if an employer is not providing your tips, or there's some other tip out policy, unfortunately, employment standards cannot help in those instances because we do not consider it a wage. So currently minimum wage is $15 per hour, as I mentioned. If you are a student, so you are if you're a young person, so you're under the age of 18 and you're a student enrolled in regular school, you are subject to a $13 an hour wage. So I won't get into that too much now, but be aware that young persons may be subject to a lower minimum wage. So one thing that's important to note, and that can happen quite often, is that if you have a short shift, the employer is required to pay you for time that they've scheduled for you that they haven't necessarily been able to provide in work. This is called 3-hour entitlements or pay for short shifts. For example, I'm working at a restaurant and I'm scheduled for 8 hours. I go into work and unfortunately the employer is like, you know what? I don't need you today. I scheduled too many people. If they send me home, I'm entitled to be paid 3 hours at minimum wage. And part of that is to compensate me for the time and effort it took to get to the job site because, it's not like we could just appear there. And so we were expecting to do some work. And so this is an incentive or a disincentive for the employer to avoid doing short shifts like this or canceling shifts without notification. So anytime that like you've showed up to the job site and they've canceled the shift, this could be applicable. As well, if you're on call or standby, so maybe you're just waiting by a phone and maybe you're shopping or at a kid's soccer game, you're not actively working there, you're just waiting for a call. When that happens, you're not entitled to be paid. However, if again, you're at a job site and you can't have a bath or go grocery shopping or see a movie, then the employer has restricted your activities and therefore that time is likely work time. So just be aware that if an employer calls you to work early and says, hey, I need you to be ready to work 15 minutes before your shift, then the likelihood is that 15 minutes ought to be paid as well. Anytime you're doing meetings or training, this is likely work time and should be paid as well. If it happens before you get a job, so before your employment starts and the employer is evaluating whether or not you have the skills and ability to do the job. That time that they are evaluating you might not be payable, but once the employment relationship starts and they require you to, say, take first aid or training on their systems, all of that time is work and should be paid. Whether you're coming in on a weekend or doing extra shifts or maybe staying late, then it's important to know whether or not there's extra time pay, including overtime if applicable. And I'll talk about overtime a little later on. Okay, so now we've worked, and let's look at that first paycheck, as it were. So an employer has to set pay periods. So a time frame in which they are going to calculate what you've worked and then eventually pay you for that. They need to set it a minimum of once a month. So twice a month is pretty common. Sometimes people get paid weekly, sometimes people get paid daily, but you can't be paid less than once a month. So, every other month, that's not acceptable, or paid when I get paid as an employer. So someone's paying me and then I pay you. That's not an employee's concern. The pay still needs to come within a reasonable amount of time. So 10 days after the end of a pay period, that's when the employer must pay the employee. And it should be, so the pay should come with that document, that pay statement, that receipt to say, this is how many hours you worked, this was your wage rate, this is the vacation pay I paid you, these are the deductions. And so that document should be clear about what it is that you were paid. That helps solve a lot of problems and confusion when both people understand what is being paid and for what time frame. It could be an e-statement or a paper statement. Both are okay. Okay, let's talk about deductions. This is, so you've gotten paid, $20 an hour, 40 hours that week, but it's not exactly the amount that you were expecting, and that's likely because of deductions. The usual deductions are taxes, Canada Pension Plan payments, and employment insurance payments, but they could also be different things that the employer's deducting, and there's certain things that they can deduct and certain things they can't. So some of the things that they can deduct is when they've made a mistake. So let's say I was getting paid $25 an hour. For some reason, they paid me $250 an hour. And I'm like, I need to run away right now. But we know that it's a mistake. So in the next payroll run, or possibly immediately, the employer will or could make a deduction to fix it. All they need to do is give written notice that the deduction is going to happen. So you don't have to kind of give permission. The employer must give this notice, and then they can fix it within 6 months of whenever the error occurred. And this is the case too, is if you took vacation when you were not yet entitled to it, and they can recover the money if employment ends before you eventually earn the vacation. And I'll talk a little bit more about vacation in the next few slides. So other things that the employer can deduct are listed here. And one of the more important things is this bullet, where you've personally allowed them to deduct it. This means things like benefits. So Blue Cross or Canada Life premiums, the employer must get your permission to deduct those things before they do so. Sometimes employers will have like cafeteria options or a social committee fund at work. The employee must sign off on that deduction as well. Some employers will provide meals and a place to live. And if they do, there's a maximum amount the employer can take as a result of providing those things. Now, things that are not allowed is faulty workmanship. What this means is that maybe you made a mistake or you failed to disclose or tell them something important and it cost them a lot of money. Anytime an employee's action causes loss to the employer, that's considered faulty workmanship. So, for example, I was supposed to paint a room forest green, but I ended up painting it olive. And the customer's so upset and they're like, you need to paint it forest green, not olive. While the employer is not permitted to make an employee pay for the paint. And if I'm required to go back and fix the problem, then I should be paid my time and wages to fix the problem. If I've lost a cell phone or maybe I've broken a laptop, all of those things I can't be responsible for either from my pay. So employers cannot deduct when I've maybe set their business on fire. Oops. They will likely be able to sue me, but they can't take my earnings that I've earned, and they should pay me as usual. This is also the case for uniforms. So anytime there's some sort of patch or branding that the employer requires an employee to wear, for example, I think Tim Hortons has like still uniformed clothing. The employer has to provide that at no cost to the employee. So if they are requiring an employee to pay for a uniform t-shirt, that's not permitted. There are special protective equipments called personal PPE, personal protective equipment. The employer is not required to provide this. Could be like a mask, a breathing, maybe safety glasses or gloves. The employer is not required to provide those, but is required to ensure you use them. Again, protective equipment is keeping you safe at the workplace so that you go home in one piece and you can come back to work the next day. If you have any questions about those things, the occupational health and safety contact center's number is on that slide there. So next up, we'll look at how long you can work and what your break times look like. So the maximum generally for employees is 12 hours per day. So if an employee works from 7 a.m., and that's when they start, they typically cannot work past 7 p.m. So that's 12 consecutive hours. They may not be working the entire 12 hours. So maybe there's lunch break or maybe they're working a split shift. Regardless of how many hours are worked within that time period, you cannot work more beyond this without these three things. So an accident, urgent work, or unforeseeable circumstance. So maybe you're working at a restaurant and the pipe bursts and everything floods. Now you're into hour 13. That's okay in this circumstance because the employer didn't plan this, and you have to ensure that the site and the location is safe for yourself and for colleagues. In general, most people aren't working past these shifts. There are some construction workers that may work up to 16 hours a day. But if you've asked to start at 7 a.m., end the day at 7 p.m. In terms of Breaks, well, breaks are when you're not working. And when you're not working, you're not entitled to be paid. So most breaks are unpaid. If you work a 5 hour or less shift, then that's kind of too short a break in order, or sorry, too short a shift in order to receive a break. So no break entitlement for that shorter shift. Some employers may provide it, but are not obligated to. For a shift that is more than 5 hours but less than 10 hours, then there's one 30-minute break. And for 10 hours or more, there's at least two 30-minute breaks. And you can do two 15-minute breaks or four 15-minute breaks. If it works out for you, then it works out for us. Essentially, employers should be ensuring employees are taking their breaks. That's for, getting some rest, going to the bathroom, having a meal, essentially some more safety items so that you can rest and continue working. In the instance where it's not possible for you to take a break, maybe you're working alone or maybe there was an accident and you need to continue working, the employer is not permitted to just simply deduct that time. If you've worked 8.5 hours and you ordinarily get a 30-minute unpaid break, and today you had to work a full 8.5 hours, then the employer simply must pay 8.5 hours. In terms of days of rest, a lot of people get Saturday and Sunday off, depending on the type of work you're doing. So 2 days of rest is pretty standard. However, 1 day of rest is actually the minimum. So you could work 6 days a week, have 1 day off, and then repeat that cycle. The maximum that you could work is actually 24 consecutive work days. And if the employer requires you to work 24 consecutive days, they have to provide 4 consecutive days of rest immediately following that shift. I don't know a lot of people who are working 24 consecutive days, but ensure that it's no more than that. 25 or 30 consecutive days is not compliant with the legislation. So let's talk about overtime. A lot of misconceptions about overtime exist currently. Every province has a different threshold. So how many hours do you work before overtime kind of clicks in? In Alberta, anytime you work over 8 in a day, let's say 10-hour shift, then those 2 hours beyond 8 are stacked away for the overtime calculation. What we also have to look at is how many hours did you work in the week? And the maximum before overtime happens is 44. So every week and every day, we would look at how many hours did you work. If you worked 10 hours in the week and that was one shift, then we know that that's 2 hours greater than 8. That means that week you get 8 hours of regular pay and 2 hours of overtime pay, even though you didn't even come close to the 44. We compare both, pay the greater. Sometimes employers like to flex time or provide banked time instead of paying overtime. When that happens, employers and employees must enter into a written overtime agreement, which allows you to bank time for 1 hour of overtime equals 1 hour of time off in the future. And this can be banked for up to 6 months. And if it's not used, then it's paid out as if you normally would pay overtime, which is 1.5 the wage rate. Now, on the right-hand side here, there are folks that aren't entitled to overtime. So if you're in one of these categories, then there's no entitlement to 1.5 times your wage rate. And be aware that people who work a salary, that's just how you're paid. It doesn't mean that you are exempt from overtime. So be aware of that if you ever are on a salary. Just don't believe that you're now not entitled to overtime if you work it. Salary is just the way that you're paid. Excuse me. So as I mentioned, overtime pay is at least 1.5 times your wage rate for all hours worked, unless you have the overtime agreement. So let's look at some really quick math. Essentially, remember we're looking at every day that the employee works, as well as every week. So every day that the employee works beyond 8 hours a day, we will add those daily hours up. So 2 hours beyond 8, 1 hour beyond 8, and 3 hours beyond 8 for this week. The total of the daily amounts is 6 overtime hours. So we set that aside and save that for our comparison later. Now we look at the total hours worked in that week, which is 54 hours. So we know that our threshold is 44, so we take what we worked minus our threshold, and we have 10 weekly overtime hours. What we do is we look at the greater of the two. Well, 10 is more than 6. I bet everybody out there would definitely want 10 overtime hours paid instead of 6. So the legislation agrees. 10 overtime hours is what's being paid. What we do see on occasion is an employer saying, you know what, you worked 10 hours today, but you didn't reach the 44-hour threshold, so no overtime yet. Or maybe you've worked, 7 straight days of 8 hours, and there's some overtime for the week, but no daily overtime. An employer might say, oh, but you never worked over 8 hours a day. That means no overtime. But hopefully now you know that it's a comparison of both the daily amount and the threshold versus the weekly amount and that threshold. So let's have a look now at vacation pay. A lot of people don't know that vacation pay is a basic entitlement, whether you're casual, part-time, full-time, temporary. As long as you're an employee and you're not exempt, you're entitled to vacation pay. Vacation time is something that you kind of have to build up to, but vacation pay starts from the very first hour that you work. So they happen at the same time typically, but they don't have to. And that's why they're often confused with one or the other. If you work less than a year, then again, for every hour that you work with the employer, you're also getting 4% of wages. So that means if the employee has made $1,000, then $40 is also available for vacation pay. Sometimes employers will pay this automatically, and sometimes employers will keep it so that when vacation is taken in the future, then that money is then paid in the future. So if you've only worked for a year or less, you're only entitled to the percentage amount. You're not entitled to time off or time off with pay. Once you've hit an anniversary date, so the next year starts, you're entitled to 2 weeks of time off. And that is also accompanied by 4% of wages. So again, from the first day that you start working to the end of the first year, you're building up all of this vacation pay and vacation time. And then the next year comes in, all of that build up you can now use and get paid for. When you've worked 5 years or more, you actually get an additional week, 3 weeks of vacation time, which equates to 6% of your yearly wages. So I didn't know about this vacation pay rule when I started working because I was a part-time employee. I was a kid out of high school, and they just paid me my hourly wage. And I was happy with that. I'm like, yay, I got some money, not realizing that there was other money that I was entitled to as well. So if I made $10,000 at that business, then that's $400 that they also owed that I never got. And I don't know how much it was now. Obviously, it's too late to do anything, but $400 is a lot of money for a kid. And I wish that I knew my rights back then so that I could have made a complaint or even asked for the money. In respects to vacation timing, so if you found an amazing flight to go somewhere and you ask your employer, hey, I'd like to take time off tomorrow. And the employer says, sorry, there is too much going on. We're too busy and we need everybody here. That sucks, but an employer can do that. When they decline vacation, then they should provide notice and a time for when an employee can take vacation. It's not always an ideal time. The employer should provide the vacation time in a timely manner, but when it occurs is up to them. Okay, let's move on to general holiday pay. So this is statutory holidays, stat pay. In order to be eligible for these special dates, you have to have certain criteria. So if your very first day of work is on Christmas, then the likelihood is that you don't have enough pieces in order to be paid extra or especially for that day. In Alberta, we have 9 general holidays and they're listed here. We just had one, Victoria Day long weekend on Monday. And coming up in no time, when June is finished, we'll have July 1st, Canada Day, which is on a Wednesday this year. So these are special because if you're eligible, you can get a day off with pay. So what does eligibility look like? Essentially, you need to work a minimum of 30 shifts with the same employer. So 30 work days with the employer, and that's step 1 for eligibility. If you have only worked 10 days or maybe 15 days with the employer, nothing special happening for these general holidays. Next up, we're looking at, okay, for example, July 1st is a Wednesday. How often did you work Wednesdays? If you sometimes worked Wednesdays and sometimes didn't, what we would do is we would take the last 9 weeks back from the holiday day itself. We'd look at 9 weeks and determine, okay, you worked at least 5 of those last Wednesdays. That means this Wednesday, when the holiday falls, is likely a work day for you. So you've met another step to be eligible for pay. If you only work 3 Wednesdays, then unfortunately, that's not enough to show a pattern that this Wednesday was going to be a day of work. And that means it's more or less a regular day of work for you. One other thing to note is that if you're absent, so maybe you're sick or maybe you've requested and have been approved for vacation, the employer has to know about it and provide consent. So don't no-show, please communicate. Employees should always communicate with their employer if they're not available to work, especially around the holidays. And once all three eligibility criteria is met, then an employee can receive average daily wage, which is what they ordinarily would have earned had they been working. So if you always work 8 hours a day, then 8 hours is what you would be paid. Instead of being at work, you could be watching fireworks, canoeing down the river, whatever the case may be, you're getting paid, but you're not at work. It's a good time. So if you don't work, you just get paid your average daily wage. And if you do work, then you may even get an additional amount of money. So average daily wage, let's say, is 8 hours. So you always work 8 hours. They're going to pay you, the employer is going to pay that regardless. Now, an employee works. Well, the employee could be also entitled to these 8 hours and receive time and a half for anything they worked on that day. So you might have heard the term double time and a half. This is 1 time, and this is 1.5 times. That's 2.5 times for work on the holiday. Now, that's not always the case. An employer may choose option B, which means that instead of paying 2.5 times, they'll just pay a regular day of work and then take this pay, so it was probably 8 hours, and move it into the future. So instead of Canada Day being the holiday, they're going to give you the day off with pay maybe at the end of August. Employer can choose that if they wish. So a lot of different options for when you work or don't work on the holiday and whether or not you're eligible. So please, I could talk about general holiday pay probably for 2 hours. So much to know in that respects. All I want you to know is that there's something special if you're eligible for that day. Next up is job protected leave. So if you're needing to be away for an extended period of time, there's protection for your job as a result. They're all unpaid. Remember, if you don't work, then the likelihood is that you're not eligible to be paid. If you have a benefit program or WCB, then that's payable through those insurance programs, but not through wages in employment standards. So leaves can be for many reasons, but essentially you're away from work for a period of time and then your job is protected. So a lot of this kind of is in the media regarding maternity leaves where the women are not able to return to their jobs even though they're ready and willing to work, or the employers change their job to something that's uncomparable, then that would be in violation of the law. So we have short-term and we have long-term leaves. So short-term leaves are if a family member passes away, maybe you have a citizenship ceremony. Hopefully you folks will get to take part in that if you haven't already. And domestic violence, if there is any conflict in the home and you need to take time off to care for yourself or a loved one, that's 10 days of protection of leave per year. And finally, this one is pretty useful. A lot of people use it for personal matters such as going to, appointments, or could be even a mental health day and you just want to rest and relax. These are protected, again, 5 days per calendar year for you to utilize. You don't have to provide a reason or medical certificate. You just have to provide as much notice as possible to the employer that you're taking the leave. One thing I kind of glossed over, I didn't even mention actually, is that in order to be eligible to receive these protections, you have to have worked or at least 90 days of employment. So you don't have to have worked exactly 90 shifts, but 90 days should have elapsed from the first day that you were employed. So here are the long-term leaves, and you do require some notice, written notice, as well as sometimes a medical certificate. Long-term illness is for yourself as an employee. Maybe you broke an arm, broke a leg, and you need time away from work to rest and recover. Critical illness is if an employee has a partner or a loved one that needs care. So an adult has 16 weeks of care if an employee is caring for an adult, and if an employee is caring for a child, 36 weeks. Compassionate care is a little bit different than critical illness in that compassionate is that the person you're caring for has a risk of dying soon. So you can take additional time to care for that individual as well. You might note that all of these weeks are mirroring EI benefits. So there is payment or could be payment from employment insurance and coinciding with the weeks that you're away. So here's a popular one that's used, maternity and parental leave, essentially up to 78 weeks total for a parent that gave birth. And there are obligations to provide notice of when an employee is leaving and when the employee plans to return to the job. So lots of options here for employment protection when you're on leave due to personal matters. Now I want to go into termination notice or pay. One thing I didn't mention earlier was in respects to scheduling. So the Employment Standards Code doesn't guarantee a minimum amount of hours that an employer is supposed to provide to an employee. It protects for when there is work, the pay was provided. There's no protection for how much work there is. So sometimes an employer will promise 40 hours a week, a full-time job, but then only provide 20 hours. Employment standards can't make any claims for the extra 20 hours that they didn't schedule you because you didn't work. Employees didn't work that time. And kind of in the same realm is that for termination notice or pay, employees aren't guaranteed to keep a job once they have it. Employer can choose to terminate an employee for a host of different reasons, and there's some obligations for them when they do so. So often what I say is that employment isn't guaranteed. If someday an employee comes into work and the employer doesn't like the t-shirt they're wearing, it doesn't seem fair that that's the reason that they're terminated. But as long as the employer provides either termination notice, pay, or a combination of both, that employee has no right to that job. And because t-shirt color is not protected under human rights, all that we would look at employment standards level is whether or not these things were paid, and if so, then we won't be able to investigate further. Now, depending on how long an employee's worked, it changes the amount of notice that an employer is required to give. So 90 days or less is often thought of as the 3-month probationary period. So in that time, both parties are getting to know each other and whether or not the employment relationship is going to work. In the instance that the employer deems that that employee is not a good fit, then they can terminate them with no notice. So no pay, no reason even. They can just say, today is your last shift. I'm paying you all your wages and your vacation pay. Good luck. When the employee works longer than 90 days and up to a maximum of 10 years, then the number of weeks increases depending on how long that employee has worked. So if I've been at somewhere for 6 years and my employer is like, Shauna, I really, really don't like your glasses. And I would be like, I have to wear them, otherwise I'm blind. And the employer's like, you know what? I don't care. Here is 5 weeks of pay. Get out of my office. That would be compliant with legislation. Doesn't seem fair, but again, we're not guaranteed work, and glasses shapes or wearing them is not a protected ground, I don't think. I'm not legally blind, so that wouldn't be a disability that I could claim under human rights. So in this case, the employer has provided me 5 weeks of termination pay. They have met their obligations and have no longer other obligations for me as an ex-employee. Now, employees are also required to provide notice. The main thing regarding an employee providing notice is that you're maintaining that respectful relationship where you can get a reference from this employer, hopefully anyways, and there's professionalism there. However, if an employee decides not to provide the notice, employment standards isn't going to punish them despite them not complying with the legislation. So I would always encourage that if you're planning on moving on to another workplace, then provide the notice based on how long you've been there. So a maximum of 2 weeks if you've worked somewhere 2 years or more, but no notice for that probationary period, and only 1 week if you've only been there less than 2 years. Excuse me. So there are instances where an employer also doesn't have to pay when employment ends. A couple of instances include if there's severe misconduct on behalf of the employee. So maybe an employee was embezzling money or stealing. Maybe they intentionally blew up the kitchen because they hate it so much. Could be a host of different things, but if the employer has sufficient reasoning, these are just some examples, then termination pay is not required. So no pay or notice. There must be my penmanship is terrible. There must be an established permanent irreversible damage to the employment relationship. And in those instances, an employee can be terminated with no notice and no pay. There are instances where it's a progressive discipline. So the employers try to improve the performance of the employee, but they keep having problems at the workplace. There's written warnings, there's suspensions, there's coaching and training, but still the employees not improving or adhering to policies. In that instance, the employer can claim progressive discipline and also not provide pay. This is very difficult to do and costs a lot of money and resources. So sometimes the employer will look at how much it costs for each week. Let's say it's $300 to terminate this person. They would pay that versus go through months of disciplinary action in order to try to reestablish the employment relationship. So just be aware of that. If you do get written warnings, that it could be kind of building a case to terminate eventually. And I want to talk a little bit about submitting complaints with our office. So now you've kind of learned all of these rules. Well, what happens when it happens to you at the workplace? One of the first things is have a conversation with your manager or supervisor. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe they don't know what the rules are because they haven't come to one of my sessions or they haven't checked our website at all. In the case, share that information with them and maybe they'll fix it. If they're a good employer, they'll be open to fixing problems. But whatever the instance and you're not able to resolve it, then you would come to our office and submit a complaint, basically indicating, hey, I worked for this employer. I was doing this job. This was my wage rate. I didn't get paid properly. Help me. And we will try to. Essentially, we have officers that will investigate the complaints. Again, we're going to be looking for evidence. What can you prove? Can you prove you even worked for this employer? Because maybe the employer will deny it. Can the employee prove how much they worked or what their wage rate was? What we'll do is try to resolve the matter voluntarily. Let's get the facts together and figure out if there was a mistake here that we're willing to fix. But maybe the employer is not interested in resolving the matter and they believe that everything that was provided as evidence is wrong, then they could ask for an assessment and eventually a formal determination. So this is what the officer has found owing, and this is an appeal process for the employer to go through to try to state more of their claim. This can take a while, but if there's problems, I would say the first thing that you should do is start communicating to the employer or our office, whether it be through the contact center or through asking a question online and then submitting a complaint. The best thing to do is kind of stand in line. And if you don't need help anymore, you can just get out of line. But some employers may promise to pay. Oh, yeah, I just give me another month. I'll pay you next month. And the month goes by and they're like, oh, I'll pay you next month, don't worry about it. I will do it. And next month goes by. Don't permit this kind of delay tactic because what happens is from the last day that an employee is employed, they have 6 months to take action and file a complaint with our office. We've seen some employers delay and promise until 6 months goes by, and then the employee has no option to file with us because there's no extension, there's no ability to change that date. It's from the last day that you were employed, 6 months later, you have a window to talk with us. And if you don't within that window, we won't be able to help after that. One thing to note is that there are a lot of things that happen in the workplace that are not related to employment standards. So records of employment, employment insurance, taxes, all of these things are federal matters, so we will refer on. If you have a workplace injury, if there's harassment or bullying, we will refer to either WCB or Workplace Compensation Board or Occupational Health and Safety. At times, Human Rights Commission will be involved depending on if there's discrimination that can be proven. And none of the rules that I had mentioned just now apply if you're part of a union. So if you have a union, then the labor board or your collective agent will be able to assist you. Employment Standards has no authority to act when a collective agreement is in place. And that's pretty much a wrap. So I have a bunch of links here that take you essentially right to our website, a place where you can file a complaint and learn more about how that looks. And I can put these in the chat shortly, but I think there's a few questions in there. So I'm happy to stick around and answer them. And in the meantime, I also have a little survey thing. If you feel inclined to fill it out, I would appreciate that. But no pressure. I will just tell my boss I did great things today anyways. But yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come up during this session here.
First question. If a child got sick, would be a mother applicable for the pay for sick leave, or employer can decline this question?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the leave page. So all the employee needs to ensure is that they have this 90 days of employment, then they become eligible for leave. So if their child is ill, they could use that time in this 5 days per year, but a reminder that this time is unpaid. So some employers will pay sick time, but the legislation does not require that. And in this case, the employee is entitled to 5 days per year. And as long as the notice is required, the employer must grant it.
If it's okay, I will translate for this
Sure.
question.
Yeah.
Ви можете запитати вихідні в ці дні, але вони не будуть оплачувані. Багато роботодавців дають оплату цих днів, але багато роботодавців також не мають оплати. Тобто це залежить від роботодавця, але вам точно повинні дати вихідні. Next question. If it's possible to send us the presentation.
So unfortunately, we're not allowed to distribute the presentation, but from what I could tell, this session was recorded, so you can share that.
Yes, I just share this tip. The next question. If I have probation period of 6 months, what are essentially different if we compare a period between 3 and 6 months since start of employment and a permanent employee after successful end of probation? Also, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Also, if an employer have to notify an employee about a successful end of the probation period.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So 90 days is kind of the probationary period for the legislation. If an employer implements a longer period, so in your case, 6 months, that doesn't change this rule. What the employer may do is they're still required to give you 1 week of notice, but they're just having a longer evaluation period for probation. It doesn't change their requirement to meet this. Some employers have a 1-year probation. Again, it doesn't change the legislated requirement. It's just their own policies that maybe they're working with. And there's no requirement for an employer in the legislation to notify if you're successful in passing probation. And again, even if you do pass probation, they may come back and say, don't like the way you put your hair today. Here's 1 week of notice, and that's done. Even though you pass probation, there's nothing to really stop them from just giving you this notice or pay and ending employment the next day.
Thank you so much. Also, we got another question on the email. It sounds like I would like to ask about my rights in situation where a pregnant woman was terminated without a clear reason. Could this be considered wrongful or discriminatory dismissal? And what legal protection are available in Alberta for pregnant employees?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So pregnant employees have no real protections under employment standards, as it were, for simply being pregnant. But when they are on maternity leave, this could be a period of time up to 13 weeks before the actual birth where they are protected. But let's say they are 4 months pregnant. They don't have any special protections outside of this, these kind of leaves. Or maybe the pregnancy is causing some injury or illness and they have to take this leave, that would be protected. But if they're a healthy individual and pregnant and the employer decides to terminate, unless you could prove that the termination was specifically due to the pregnancy, that would be a human rights issue. So discrimination based on, that matter. But employment standards wise, as long as the pregnant employee received these entitlements, then employment standards wouldn't be able to do much more. However, I would look into human rights to see what they could help with, only if you have enough evidence to support that termination was because of the pregnancy. Again, they could just say, don't like the way your t-shirt looks, and use that as a reason, and that would be permittable. The issue is that we have kind of these standards of ethics where that if you terminate a pregnant person, that's a really bad look. But legally, have they met kind of this threshold? And as long as they've done that, the ethics that kind of are above there don't always apply, at least not for employment standards.
Thank you for the answer. Next question. A person was injured but kept working and a few days later was fired. The person worked 2 weeks total, like before the injury. Is this person eligible for WCB?
So WCB, I don't think that I'd be able to provide information on. So I would say call their office and see what's available. For employment standards, there's no protection because it's not yet 90 days employed. Also, possibly human rights to see if the termination or the effect on employment was due to the injury. It definitely would be, is it OH&S related if the injury occurred at work? That's probably another place that you can explore kind of recourse.
Thank you. If a fired / discriminated employee complains to authorities, will it be public or somehow known to the any future employer?
From my understanding, no. Unless it goes to public trial or hearing, it's generally not posted anywhere in respects to the proceedings. So if you've made a complaint against an employer, the next employer isn't going to know any details and will not be able to access any details of a previous complaint. So they shouldn't know that information.
Thank you. There is few new questions in the chat. New job, no experience before. The employer suggests to work without payment. Is it eligible? Like volunteering?
So volunteering is a special circumstance where typically the business is either a nonprofit or other kind of community agency. I had an employer who had volunteers. They were cleaners. So they just cleaned for their business. And then I really couldn't understand the benefit kind of to the individuals for that work. Um, would they necessarily be contributing to uh, social classes or their community, or are they simply benefiting that employer? So that's kind of what we look at in terms of uh, volunteerism, is that is there a profit involved with the work that this person provided? If so, they're likely more an employee.
Thank you. If the employer should to pay wages if the employees is absent due to illness and has a sick leave certificate?
So an employer is not required to pay when you're sick. The employer is only obligated to pay when there is work performed. So they may provide sick days. Again, that's a benefit for the employee, but are not obligated to when you don't actively work.
Thank you. Um, can person accumulate vacation day every year, or if it's don't use, if they will be lost and won't be available the following year?
Yeah, that's a really great question as well. So some employers will say use it or lose it, and that you never lose the money, but you may lose the days. You're not supposed to lose the days, but obviously we can't, us, the employment standards, can't go back in time and give you the days back. We can ensure that the pay is all there. So, for example, you have vacation pay in the amount of $2,000. The employer says if you don't take vacation, you'll lose it. You'll never lose the $2,000 because that belongs to you. But if next year they say you can't bring it forward, then we would educate them and say that, that's not permitted. You have to give the time off. But if the employer decides not to, we would just ensure that the pay still remains. So the $2,000 moves forward. Maybe the time is lost, but this new year, you're going to earn another $2,000. So at least this year, you'll get $4,000. But a use it or lose it is an employer tactic to avoid paying when vacation time isn't scheduled, because the employer is like I mentioned, they can tell you when you take vacation, and maybe they'll never give you it. And then they say, oh, you didn't use it, so now you lose it, which is not truly the case. You can still get your pay.
Thank you. The last question that we have in our chat and that we have, if they don't raise my salary and I've been working for 4 years, is it legal?
It is legal. So pay raises and promises of increased hours or pay rate is not under minimum standards. You could be working for 15 years and they could still be paying $15 an hour. That is still minimum wage. That is still okay. Not great, but like I mentioned at the beginning, it's minimum.
Thank you for the information, and we will wait for maybe last questions that people can ask. And I would like also ask you, maybe you can give some advice from your experience or what you would like to say for newcomers.
Yeah, I know that I've been to a lot of newcomer events where a lot of people are looking for work. They're extremely skilled and they simply can't find work. Unfortunately, there's just the worst job market currently. Um, keep persevering, keep trying, and keep looking at different supports that could help you. And the main thing is, again, getting that job is vital, but if you're not getting paid properly, then that job wasn't worth that struggle. In the instance where you finally got a job and it's not ideal and all of the things are happening that shouldn't happen, what you can do is continue to try to work under those conditions, record everything, document everything. And then when someday you can get another job, you can make a complaint once you leave. Because sometimes employers will retaliate, and there's not a ton that we'll be able to do without evidence. So somebody could say, hey, I didn't get paid overtime properly. And the employer is like, oh, you want overtime? Well, you're not a good fit here. So the next day you're terminated. And again, the employer can terminate you before you work 90 days, or they can give you the notice. Unless there's evidence to say that you were terminated because you asked for overtime, there's not a ton that we can do. So if there's any problems and you're afraid to speak up, then just start recording everything. And if it's possible, start looking for an employer that will treat you properly. Not always easy, I know, but yeah, the last thing you want is to work for months and months and months and never get the proper pay.